The great chamber of the Galactic Council was the largest room Jake had ever seen in his life. The ceiling rose so high that clouds actually formed near the top, and the walls were made of some kind of crystal that changed color depending on the mood of the beings inside. Right now, the crystals were a deep angry red, and Jake knew that was not a good sign for him. He stood alone in the center of the chamber, his hands bound in front of him with energy cuffs that hummed softly against his wrists. Around him, in rising tiers that seemed to go on forever, sat the representatives of 100 different alien species. Some had scales, some had feathers, some were made of living crystal or flowing liquid or things that Jake could not even begin to describe. All of them were looking at him, with expressions that ranged from disgust to curiosity, to something that might have been fear. Jake was a pilot. He had joined the Earth Space Fleet when he was 18 years old, fresh out of high school and hungry for adventure. He had spent the next 10 years flying cargo ships, patrol vessels, and eventually the diplomatic transport Horizon. It was supposed to be an easy assignment. Ferry diplomats around, attend boring meetings, and try not to fall asleep during trade negotiations. Nobody had told him that the job would end with him standing trial in front of every major species in the known galaxy. The High Arbiter floated down from his platform, his crystalline body catching the light and throwing rainbow patterns across the floor. His name was Lan, and he was old even by the standards of his ancient species. His voice echoed through the chamber like wind chimes in a storm. "Jake of Earth," Lan said, "you have been found guilty of assault against a noble of the Empire. The evidence is clear. You struck Lord Al with your bare hands during a diplomatic function. Do you deny this?" Jake looked up at the floating arbiter and felt a tired anger burning in his chest. "No," he said. "I hit him. I would do it again." A gasp rippled through the chamber. The crystals on the walls flickered to an even darker shade of red. Somewhere in the gallery above, Jake heard a familiar voice curse quietly. That would be Casey, his best friend and fellow crew member on the Horizon. She had tried to warn him that speaking honestly would only make things worse. But Jake had never been good at keeping his mouth shut. Lan's crystalline face showed no expression, but his voice grew colder. "You admit to your crime and show no remorse. This council has no choice but to impose the maximum sentence." "He was going to kill Ambassador Peters," Jake said, his voice rising. "I saw the needle in his hand. He was going to inject her with poison. I stopped him. That is not a crime. That is saving someone's life." "Lord Al claims the device was a medical instrument," Lan replied. "He says he was attempting to help the ambassador, who appeared unwell." "That is a lie, and everyone in this room knows it." The chamber erupted in noise. Alien voices shouted in a dozen different languages, and the translation devices in Jake's ears struggled to keep up. He caught fragments of arguments, some defending him and others demanding his immediate execution. The delegation was on their feet, their purple skin flushed with rage, their 4 arms waving in elaborate gestures of outrage. Lan raised one crystalline limb, and silence fell instantly. The High Arbiter had that effect on people. When a being who had lived for 10,000 years told you to be quiet, you listened. "The evidence presented by the Empire has been examined and found valid under galactic law," Lan said. "The claims of the accused have been examined and found insufficient. This council recognizes that humans are new to the galactic community and may not fully understand our customs. For this reason, we will show mercy." Jake felt his heart sink. In his experience, when someone in power talked about showing mercy, it usually meant they were about to do something terrible. "Jake," Lan continued, "you are hereby sentenced to exile. You will be transported to the planet designated 7, where you will remain for the rest of your natural life." The silence that followed was different from before. This was not the silence of respect or obedience. This was the silence of horror. Jake looked around the chamber and saw that even the had gone pale. Whatever 7 was, it scared them. A small screen materialized in front of Jake, showing images and data about his new home. He saw a world of black rock and red skis, of volcanoes that never stopped erupting and storms that could tear apart starships. He saw creatures with too many teeth and too many claws, predators that hunted in packs and killed without mercy. He saw bacteria that could eat through metal and plants that sprayed acid at anything that moved. 7 was what the galactic community called a. It was a planet so hostile to life that no sapient species had ever survived there for more than a few days. The Council used it as an execution method for the worst criminals, a way to kill someone without technically killing them. They would drop you on the surface with basic supplies and let nature take its course. No one had ever come back from 7. Jake stared at the images for a long moment. He thought about his parents back on Earth, about his sister who had just had her first baby, about all the things he would never see or do again. He thought about Casey up in the gallery, probably crying or planning some desperate rescue mission that would only get her killed too. Then something strange happened. Jake looked at the images of 7, at the predators and the volcanoes and the toxic atmosphere, and he started to laugh. The sound echoed through the silent chamber, and every alien in the room stared at him like he had lost his mind. Maybe he had. Maybe the stress of the trial had finally broken something inside him. But as Jake laughed, he realized that he was not afraid. He had grown up in rural Montana, in a cabin at the edge of a wilderness that would have terrified most city people. He had hunted bears with his grandfather before he was old enough to drive. He had survived blizzards and wildfires, and that one time, a mountain lion had wandered into their backyard. He had broken bones and fought infections, and learned 100 different ways to stay alive when everything around him wanted him dead. 7 was dangerous. 7 was deadly. But Jake was from Earth, and Earth had been training humans to survive the impossible for millions of years. He looked up at Lan and smiled. "When do I leave?" Up in the gallery, Casey watched her friend being led away in chains, and she made a silent promise to herself. She would find a way to get him back. No matter how long it took, no matter what laws she had to break, she would not let Jake die alone on some alien hellhole. She had 6 months. She had better get started. The drop pod hit the atmosphere of 7 like a bullet fired into water. The whole craft shook and screamed as heat built up around the hull, turning the small window into a rectangle of solid orange fire. Jake was strapped into a seat that had been designed for a species with 4 legs and no spine, which meant every bump and jolt sent pain shooting through his back and shoulders. He gritted his teeth and held on. The descent took 11 minutes. Jake knew this because he counted every second, using the rhythm to keep himself calm and focused. It was a trick his grandfather had taught him during their first hunting trip together, when Jake was just 7 years old and terrified of the dark forest around them. Count the seconds. Focus on the numbers. Fear cannot touch you when your mind is busy with something else. At minute 9, the parachutes deployed. At minute 10, the retro rockets fired. At minute 11, the pod slammed into the ground with enough force to rattle Jake's teeth and send stars dancing across his vision. Then there was silence. Jake sat in the ruined pod for a long moment, breathing hard and checking himself for injuries. His lip was bleeding where he had bitten it during the impact. His ribs ached in a way that suggested cracks but not breaks. His left ankle throbbed when he moved it, probably sprained from the landing. Nothing fatal. Nothing that would stop him from surviving. He unbuckled the alien harness and stood up slowly, his head spinning from the sudden change in gravity. 7 had a gravity of 1.4 times Earth standard, which meant everything weighed almost half again as much as it should. His own body felt heavy and sluggish, like he was trying to move through thick mud. The pod's hatch had been damaged in the landing, and it took Jake 3 hard kicks to break it open. When he finally stumbled out onto the surface of his new home, the first thing he noticed was the smell. Sulfur ash. something rotting in the distance. The air was thick and hot, carrying a weight that pressed against his lungs with every breath. Above him, the sky was the color of old blood, choked with clouds of volcanic smoke that blocked out the sun. The ground beneath his feet was black rock, sharp and jagged, stretching away in all directions like a frozen sea of darkness. Jake had seen photos of Seven during his trial, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of standing on its surface. This was not just a hostile planet. This was a world that hated life, that wanted to crush and burn and dissolve anything soft and warm and breathing. He loved it immediately. The feeling surprised him, but Jake did not fight it. He had always been drawn to wild places, to the parts of nature that most people avoided. His grandfather used to say that civilization made men weak, that the only way to truly know yourself was to face the wilderness alone and unarmed. Jake had thought those words were just the ramblings of an old man who had spent too much time in the mountains. Now, standing on an alien with nothing but a knife and a small survival kit, Jake understood what his grandfather had meant. He turned back to the pod and began gathering his supplies. The Galactic Council had given him a standard exile package, which contained a water purifier, a fire starter, a thin blanket, enough food rations for 2 weeks, a basic medical kit, and a knife made of some alien metal that seemed sharper than anything Jake had ever used. There was also a small device that he recognized as a locator beacon, designed to broadcast his position to the monitoring satellites in orbit. Jake considered smashing the beacon but decided against it. Let them watch. Let them see what a human could do. He spent the first hour exploring the area around his landing site. The terrain was rough but not impossible, with rocky outcrops that could provide shelter and several deep crevices that might lead to caves. In the distance, he could see what looked like a dried riverbed cutting through the landscape, which suggested that water might flow through the area during certain times of year. The predators found him during the second hour. Jake heard them before he saw them, a clicking sound that reminded him of the cicadas back home in Montana. He turned slowly, his hand moving to the knife at his belt, and found himself face to face with 3 creatures that looked like someone had combined a wolf with a scorpion and then added extra legs for good measure. They were each about the size of a large dog, covered in black armored plates that matched the rock around them. Their heads were eyeless, but Jake could see nostril slits that flared as they sniffed the air. Their tails curved up over their backs, ending in stingers that dripped with some kind of liquid. The creatures spread out slowly, surrounding him with the practiced ease of experienced hunters. Jake had seen wolves do the same thing when stalking deer. He knew what came next. The first one lunged at him from the left, and Jake moved on instinct. He the attack and brought his knife down hard on the creature's back, aiming for the gap between its armored plates. The blade bit deep, and the creature screamed, a high-pitched sound that hurt Jake's ears. The second creature came at him from behind, but Jake was already spinning, using his momentum to drive the knife into its head. The blade punched through the armor like it was made of paper, and the creature dropped to the ground without a sound. The third one hesitated. Jake could see it processing what had just happened, its eyeless head swinging back and forth as it tried to understand how it had died so quickly. Then it turned and ran, disappearing into the rocks with a speed that seemed impossible for something with so many legs. Jake stood over the bodies of the 2 dead creatures, breathing hard and covered in their blood. His heart was pounding and his hands were shaking, but he was alive. He was alive and he had won. He looked up at the red sky and imagined the alien observers watching him through their satellites. He wondered what they were thinking. He wondered if they had ever seen anyone survive this long. The sun was starting to set, which meant Jake needed to find shelter. He grabbed one of the dead creatures by its tail and began dragging it toward a nearby cave he had spotted earlier. The meat would last him several days if he rationed it properly, and the armored plates might be useful for making tools or armor of his own. As he walked, Jake found himself thinking about his grandfather again. The old man had died 3 years ago, peacefully in his sleep after a long life spent in the wilderness he loved. Jake had always regretted not spending more time with him, not learning everything the old man had to teach. But maybe he had learned enough. Maybe the lessons of his childhood, the hunting trips and the survival training and the long nights spent under the stars, had prepared him for this moment without him even knowing it. Jake reached the cave just as the last light faded from the sky. He built a fire using the starter from his kit and some dried vegetation he had gathered along the way. He cooked a portion of the creature's meat over the flames and found that it tasted surprisingly good, like chicken mixed with something he could not identify. He ate his dinner alone in the darkness, listening to the strange sounds of the alien night, and for the first time since his trial, Jake felt at peace. He was going to survive this. He was going to do more than survive. He was going to thrive. 3 months passed on 7, and Jake did something that no one in the galaxy had ever done before. He built a home. It started with the cave. Jake spent the first 2 weeks reinforcing the entrance with rocks and sharpened stakes made from a strange wood he found growing near the volcanic vents. The wood was dense and hard, almost like iron, and it held an edge better than anything he had ever worked with on Earth. He built a door from woven branches and sealed the gaps with mud mixed with volcanic ash, creating a barrier that kept out the wind and the smaller predators. Then he expanded. He discovered that the cave was actually part of a larger network of tunnels, some natural and some carved by water that had flowed through the rock long ago. He explored these tunnels carefully, mapping them in his mind and marking the safe paths with scratches on the walls. Some led to dead ends. Some led to underground pools of water that was cleaner than anything on the surface. And one led to a vast chamber with a ceiling so high that Jake could not see the top. He made that chamber his home. The monitoring satellites tracked his every move, and somewhere far away in the crystal towers of the Galactic Council, High Arbiter Lan watched with growing disbelief. The human was not dying. The human was not even struggling. The human was building shelters and hunting predators, and behaving as if 7 was nothing more than an extended camping trip. Lan had served as High Arbiter for 300 years. In that time, he had sentenced hundreds of criminals to exile on throughout the galaxy. None of them had lasted more than a week. The record was held by a warrior from the Empire, a species known for their physical strength and combat prowess, who had survived for 9 days before being killed by a pack of local predators. Jake had been on 7 for 92 days and showed no signs of slowing down. "Show me his compound," Lan said to his aide, a nervous creature named Trill who had been watching the feeds for so long that his eyes had developed a permanent twitch. Trill brought up the images on the display screen, and Lan felt something he had not experienced in centuries. He felt afraid. The human had built a small fortress. The cave entrance was now protected by a wall of stacked stones, with gaps that allowed for visibility and defense. Inside the cave, there were multiple chambers, each serving a different purpose. One was a sleeping area, with a bed made from animal hides and dried vegetation. One was a food storage room, filled with preserved meat and edible plants that the human had somehow identified among the toxic native flora. One was a workshop, where the human had created tools from bone and stone, and the strange ironwood from the volcanic vents. But the most disturbing thing was not the fortress itself. It was the creature sitting at the entrance like a loyal guard dog. Jake had named the creature Duke, though he had no idea if it could hear him or understand the concept of names. Duke was one of the scorpion wolf predators that had attacked Jake on his first day, a juvenile that Jake had found wounded and abandoned about 6 weeks into his exile. Against all logic and common sense, Jake had decided to help it. The other creatures of its pack had rejected Duke because of a deformed leg that made him slower than the rest. They had left him to die, following the harsh law of survival that ruled on 7. But Jake had seen something in the creature's eyeless face, a kind of desperate intelligence that reminded him of the stray dogs he used to rescue as a kid back in Montana. He had cleaned Duke's wounds and fed him scraps of meat until the creature was strong enough to walk again. He had fashioned a kind of splint for the damaged leg, allowing Duke to move almost normally. And slowly, day by day, the predator that should have been Jake's enemy became something else entirely. Duke followed Jake everywhere now. He slept at the entrance to Jake's cave, alert to any approaching threats. He helped Jake hunt, using his superior sense of smell to track prey through the rocky terrain. He even learned to respond to simple commands, sitting and staying and coming when Jake called his name. The scientists on the monitoring team could not explain it. The creatures of Seven were not supposed to be domesticable. They were pure predators, driven by instinct and hunger, with no capacity for loyalty or affection. And yet here was Duke, wagging his segmented tail whenever Jake approached, nuzzling his armored head against Jake's hand like a giant alien puppy. Jake, for his part, was not surprised. Humans had been domesticating predators for thousands of years. Wolves had become dogs. Wild cats had become. Even horses, which were prey animals built to run from anything that moved, had been tamed and trained to carry humans on their backs. If humanity could accomplish all that on Earth, taming one alien creature on Seven was hardly a challenge. By the end of the third month, Jake had established a routine. He woke each morning with the dim red light that passed for dawn on this world. He ate a breakfast of dried meat and some root vegetables he had discovered growing in the caves. He spent the mornings hunting or gathering supplies, always with Duke at his side. He spent the afternoons working on his compound, reinforcing walls and building new tools and slowly transforming his shelter into something that could sustain him for years. And in the evenings, he sent messages to the satellites. The first message was simple. He had arranged rocks on a flat plain near his compound, forming letters that were visible from orbit. The message read, "I am alive." The second message, sent a week later, read, "Send more supplies." The third message, sent at the end of his third month, read, "Planning to stay." High Arbiter Lan read that third message and felt the fear in his ancient heart grow stronger. This human was not behaving like a condemned prisoner. He was behaving like a colonist, like someone who intended to make Seven his permanent home. "What do we do?" Trill asked, his voice trembling. Lan did not answer. He was thinking about the stories he had heard about Earth, about the world that humans called home. He had always dismissed those stories as exaggerations, propaganda designed to make the young species seem more impressive than they really were. But now he was not so sure. The stories said that Earth was a two. They said that humans had evolved on a planet filled with predators and disasters and diseases that would have wiped out any other species. They said that humans were not fragile despite their soft skin and blunt teeth. They said that humans were survivors, adapters, conquerors of any environment they encountered. Lan had sentenced Jake to death on Seven. Instead, he might have just given humanity its first foothold in the most hostile corner of the galaxy. And that thought terrified him more than anything else. Casey had not slept in 3 days. Her eyes were red and her hands were shaking from too much coffee and not enough rest, but she did not care. She was so close now that she could taste it, and nothing was going to stop her from bringing Jake home. The ship was called the Lucky Break, a name that Casey had chosen herself as a kind of prayer. It was an old cargo hauler that she had bought for almost nothing from a scrapyard on the edge of human space. The previous owner had claimed the ship was cursed, that every crew who flew it ended up dead or worse. Casey had laughed at the superstition and spent the next 4 months rebuilding the vessel from the ground up. Now the Lucky Break was the fastest civilian ship in the outer colonies, equipped with military-grade engines and sensors that Casey had definitely not acquired through legal means. It carried a crew of 4 humans who had each agreed to risk their lives for a man they barely knew, simply because he was one of their own. Her brother sat in the co-pilot seat, checking the weapons systems for the 100th time, was a former Marine who had served 2 tours in the border conflicts before retiring to work as a security consultant. When Casey had called him with her plan, he had not even asked for details. He had just packed a bag and caught the next transport to her station. Behind them in the cargo hold, Dr. Torres was preparing the medical equipment they would need if Jake was injured. Was a who had spent her career studying and the creatures that lived on them. She had written 3 books about human survival in hostile environments, and she had practically begged Casey to let her join the mission. And in the engine room, keeping the ship running despite its age and questionable modifications, was the best pilot Casey had ever met, a man who could fly through an asteroid field blindfolded and come out the other side without a scratch. He owed Jake his life from a mission 3 years ago, when Jake had pulled him from a burning ship seconds before it exploded, had been waiting for a chance to repay that debt. The lucky break dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system, and Casey felt her heart begin to race. "Scanners picking up the monitoring satellites," reported from the pilot's seat. "I count 6 of them in a standard surveillance pattern. They will detect us in about 30 minutes. "That is enough time," Casey said. "Take us in." The approach to 7 was rough. The planet's atmosphere was filled with electrical storms and volcanic ash that played havoc with their sensors and threatened to tear the ship apart. Flew with his usual impossible skill, threading through gaps in the clouds and riding the turbulence like a surfer riding a wave. By the time they broke through to the surface, everyone on board was holding onto something to keep from being thrown across the room. "I have got his location," said, studying the scanner readings. "Heat signature about 2 kilometers north of our position. It is big, Casey, much bigger than a single person." Casey frowned. The satellite feeds had shown Jake alive and healthy, but they had not given her a clear picture of what he had built. She had expected to find him huddled in a cave somewhere, thin and desperate and barely hanging on. What she found instead took her breath away. Jake was waiting for them when they landed, standing at the entrance to what could only be described as a small village. He had built multiple structures from stone and wood, arranged in a rough circle around a central courtyard. There was a main building that looked like a combination of a house and a fortress, with thick walls and narrow windows designed for defense. There was a smaller building that appeared to be a workshop, with tools and half-finished projects visible through the open door. There was even what looked like a greenhouse, made from some kind of transparent material that Casey did not recognize, with rows of plants growing inside. And there were the creatures. Casey counted 6 of them, all identical to the predators she had seen in the briefing files about 7. They sat around the compound like guard dogs, their eyeless heads turning toward the ship as it landed. One of them was larger than the others, with a slight limp in its front left leg, and it positioned itself directly between the ship and Jake like a loyal protector. Casey walked down the landing ramp slowly, her hand resting on the weapon at her hip. She had prepared herself for many things on this rescue mission, but she had not prepared for this. Jake looked different. He was leaner than she remembered, his body hardened by months of physical labor and survival. His skin was darker, tanned by the dim red sun of 7, and marked with scars that told stories she could only imagine. He had grown a beard that desperately needed trimming, and his hair was longer and wilder than regulation allowed. But his eyes were the same, bright and alive and full of that stubborn determination that had made him such a good pilot and such a terrible prisoner. "Took you long enough," Jake called out, his face breaking into a grin. Casey stopped at the bottom of the ramp and stared at him. She wanted to run to him, to hug him and make sure he was real, but the creatures around the compound were watching her with an intensity that made her nervous. "You absolute lunatic," she said. "What have you done?" Jake shrugged, the casual gesture so familiar that it made Casey's chest ache. "I survived, just like I said I would." "You did more than survive. You colonized a by yourself, with alien predators as pets." Duke is not a pet, Jake said, reaching down to pat the largest creature on its armored head. He is family. Came down the ramp behind Casey, his hand on his weapon and his eyes scanning the perimeter. We need to move fast. The monitoring satellites will have detected our ship by now. The Galactic Council will send someone to investigate. Jake nodded, but he did not move toward the ship. Instead, he looked around at the compound he had built, at the creatures who had become his pack, at the world that had tried to kill him and failed. "I am not leaving," he said. Casey felt her heart drop. "What?" "I am not leaving," Jake repeated. "This is my home now. I built it with my own hands. I am not going to abandon it just because some alien bureaucrats decided I should be dead." "Jake, you cannot stay here. This planet will kill you eventually." Jake laughed and the sound echoed off the rocky walls around them. "This planet has been trying to kill me for 6 months. I am still here. I am stronger than when I arrived. I have food, water, shelter, and an army of apex predators who will fight to protect me." He looked at Casey with an expression she had never seen before, a mix of peace and purpose that seemed almost out of place on his familiar face. "Earth made me for this," Jake said. "Every survival instinct, every adaptation, every lesson I learned growing up in the wilderness, it all led to this moment. I am not running from it. I am embracing it." Tors had joined them at the bottom of the ramp, her scientific curiosity overcoming her fear of the predators. "He is right," she said quietly. "The data supports everything he is saying. Humans evolved on one of the most dangerous planets in the galaxy. We are perfectly suited for environments like this." Casey looked at her friend, at the compound he had built, at that had become his kingdom. She thought about all the laws she had broken to get here, all the risks she had taken, all the plans she had made to bring him home. And then she made a decision. "Fine," she said. "Then we stay too." The broadcast reached every inhabited system in the galaxy within 3 standard days. It traveled along communication relays and through hyperspace beacons, passed from station to station and ship to ship until there was not a single sapient being who had not heard the message from 7. Jake stood in front of the camera that Casey had brought from the Lucky Break, his face lit by the red glow of the volcanic sky behind him. He had trimmed his beard and cleaned himself up for the recording, but he had kept the scars visible. He wanted the galaxy to see what survival looked like. "My name is Jake," he began. 6 months ago, the Galactic Council exiled me to this planet. They called it 7. They called it They expected me to die within days like every other prisoner they had sent here before me." He paused, letting the words sink in. "They were wrong." The recording showed images of his compound, the stone walls and wooden structures that he had built with nothing but his hands and his determination. It showed his gardens growing in the greenhouse, the predators lounging in the courtyard like domesticated dogs, the workshop filled with tools and weapons crafted from the bones and shells of creatures that had tried to kill him. "Humans come from Jake continued. "Our home planet, Earth, would be classified as extremely hostile by galactic standards. We evolved alongside predators that could tear us apart with their claws and teeth. We survived ice ages that froze the oceans and volcanoes that blocked out the sun. We fought diseases that killed millions and disasters that wiped out entire civilizations." His voice grew stronger, harder, filled with a pride that came from the deepest part of his being. "We did not become soft. We did not become weak. We adapted. We overcame. We survived. And when the universe threw something new at us, we did not run away. We faced it head-on and we conquered it." The Galactic Council watched the broadcast in their great crystal chamber, and for the first time in recorded history, the assembled delegates were completely silent. High Arbiter Land sat in his floating chair, his crystalline body flickering with colors that no one could interpret. The delegation had left the chamber entirely, unwilling to witness the humiliation of their failed execution. Jake was supposed to be dead. Instead, He was broadcasting a message of defiance to the entire galaxy, standing on a world that should have killed him 100 times over, looking healthier and stronger than he had ever looked in his life. "Your council uses exile too as a death sentence," Jake said in the recording. "But for humans, it is just another challenge, another obstacle to overcome, another Tuesday." He smiled, and there was something in that smile that made even the oldest and most powerful beings in the galaxy feel a chill run through their strange bodies. "To any human who hears this message," Jake continued, "I have claimed this world in the name of Earth. I am calling it New Texas because it reminds me of the stories my grandfather used to tell about the old frontier days. If you want a fresh start, if you want a place where the weak cannot follow and the strong can build something new, come find me. Bring your families, bring your skills, bring your dreams." He spread his arms wide, gesturing to the harsh landscape behind him. "Welcome to New Texas." The broadcast ended, and the galaxy held its breath. The first wave of human colonists arrived within a year. They came in old cargo ships and converted transports, families and loners and dreamers who wanted something more than the crowded worlds of human space could offer. They brought seeds and tools and livestock, determination and stubbornness, and that particular human ability to look at something impossible and say, "I can do that." Jake welcomed them all. He showed them how to build shelters that could withstand the storms. He taught them which plants were safe to eat and which would kill them in minutes. He introduced them to Duke and the other predators, explaining how to earn their respect and eventually their loyalty. The colony grew. Within 5 years, New Texas had a population of 10,000 humans living in settlements scattered across the planet's surface. They had built farms and factories, schools and hospitals, a thriving community in a place that was supposed to be a grave. Within 10 years, they had applied for membership in the Galactic Council as an independent world. The application was approved unanimously. Not a single delegate voted against it, and afterward, when asked why they had supported the humans so quickly, most of them gave the same answer. They were afraid of what would happen if they said no. High Arbiter Lan retired from his position shortly after New Texas gained its independence. In his final address to the council, he offered a warning that would be studied by alien scholars for generations to come. "We made a grave error," he said, his crystalline body dim with age and exhaustion. "We looked at humanity and saw a young species, barely capable of interstellar travel. We saw their small bodies, their lack of natural weapons, their soft skin that seemed so vulnerable. We assumed they were weak because they did not look strong." He paused, and the chamber waited in silence. "We forgot to ask how a species so fragile could have survived on a world so deadly. We forgot that the universe does not protect its children. It tests them. It breaks them. It forges them in fire and blood and endless struggle. And humanity was forged in the hottest fire of all." Lan looked around at the assembled delegates, at the representatives of 100 species who had ruled the galaxy for millions of years, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "Do not exile humans too. Do not corner them. Do not threaten what they love, because when you do, you will learn what every predator on there learned millions of years ago." He let the silence stretch for a long moment. "Humans do not run. Humans do not hide. Humans do not give up. They adapt. They overcome, and then they come for you." The chamber remained silent as the old arbiter floated away for the last time. On New Texas, Jake stood on a hilltop overlooking the settlement that had grown from his lonely compound. The red sky was the same as it had always been, filled with volcanic smoke and the distant rumble of eruptions. The air was still thick and hot, carrying the smell of sulfur that had become so familiar it was almost comforting. But everything else had changed. Below him, he could see streets and buildings, fields and factories, thousands of humans going about their daily lives in a place that the galaxy had called impossible. He could see children playing in the courtyards, their laughter carrying up to him on the wind. He could see Duke and his descendants patrolling the perimeter, loyal guardians who had become as much a part of the colony as the humans themselves. Casey walked up beside him, her hair shorter now and streaked with gray from the years of hard work and harder decisions. She had become the colony's chief administrator, handling the politics and logistics that Jake had no patience for. They made a good team, the dreamer and the organizer, the survivor and the builder. "The council just confirmed our membership," she said. "We are officially an independent world." Jake nodded, but he did not smile. He was thinking about his grandfather, about the old man who had taught him to survive in the wilderness of Montana so many years ago. He was thinking about all the humans throughout history who had faced impossible odds and refused to give up, who had conquered deserts and oceans and mountains that should have killed them. He was thinking about what it meant to be human. "We did it," Casey said softly. "We actually did it." Jake finally allowed himself a small smile. "This is just the beginning," he said. "There are out there, other places that the galaxy has written off as impossible, other challenges waiting to be conquered." He looked up at the red sky, at the stars hidden behind the volcanic clouds, and felt the same fire burning in his chest that had kept him alive through 6 months of exile. Humanity is just getting started. Far away in the crystal towers of the Galactic Council, the delegates watched and waited and wondered what the humans would do next. They had a feeling they would not like the answer, but there was nothing they could do to stop it. That was the thing about humans. They always found a way.